points. But, and you know, I have to say that I find it interesting when NDP members lament the fact that they feel that their government, their premier, is not getting the credit they deserve for defending the oil and gas industry and for taking up the fight on pipelines. Well, I will tell you there's a very simple reason why that is happening, and that is this government has a deficit. And this government has a deficit in credibility. It's not a dollar, well, they have a dollar and cents deficit as well, but they have a credibility deficit. And that credibility deficit, Mr. Speaker, has been built up over a long time. It didn't just happen overnight, and it is because that not only have they shown in the very recent past that they were opposed to pipeline development, in the very recent past that they were opposed to the oil and gas industry itself, but their cohorts in other provinces, in fact, the government that is opposing the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the NDP in British Columbia, are opposed to the oil and gas industry. The national NDP is similarly opposed to the oil and gas industry and opposed to pipelines. And at the not so long ago convention of the national NDP here in Edmonton, despite what I understand was an impassioned speech by the Premier saying why the LEAP manifesto would be bad for Alberta and bad for Canada, the national NDP proceeded with it anyway. So, Mr. Speaker, whether you like it or not, whether you care to admit it or not, you folks have a credibility deficit. And the people in the oil and gas industry simply don't trust you. Now, they may come around to trusting you someday, but at least right now, they don't trust you. And the reason they don't trust you is because supporting oil and gas is not in your nature. And what we mean by that is it's not part of your past history. It's not in your nature. And, you know, there's a fable, Mr. Speaker, and you can probably appreciate that coming from me, it's an animal fable. It's been around since the mid-50s, and it's the fable of the scorpion and the frog. And it applies here. And the fable goes like this. One day, a frog and a scorpion found themselves at the side of a river that they both wished to cross. And the frog, of course, is able to swim, but the scorpion is not. And so the scorpion says to the frog, "Would you allow me to ride on your back to the other side while you swim across the river?" And the frog, who is suspicious of this arrangement, says to the scorpion, "Yes, but what if you sting me?" And the scorpion says, "Well, if I sting you, then we both shall die. And so why would I do that?" So the frog, somewhat reluctantly, allows the scorpion to climb on its back and starts swimming across the torrent. About halfway across, the frog feels a sharp stabbing pain in his back and then starts to feel the effects of the scorpion's paralyzing venom in his body. And as the frog is sinking below the surface of the water with his dying breath, the frog turns to the scorpion and says, "Why?" And the scorpion, with his dying breath, says, "It's in my nature." And if you're wondering what the correlation here is, the oil and gas industry is the frog, and you folks are the scorpion. And that is what we have in Alberta. We have an industry that is trying to trust the current government, the industry that in many ways has no choice but to trust the current government because it has to work with that current government. And yet it knows at any time that the scorpion could return to what is in its nature. And when I talk to oil and gas people, certainly in my constituency and around the province, the oil and gas industry folks that I talk to tell me that, at least at this point, they simply do not trust this government. And Neither do most Albertans on the issue of oil and gas and promoting pipelines. That's not to say that the efforts that have been put forward by the Premier especially haven't been appreciated. I think those efforts have been acknowledged, and they should be, by Albertans right across the province. And certainly a great deal of effort has been put in, but the problem that you've got, and the reason you're having so much trouble convincing people, is because of your credibility deficit. And making up that credibility deficit is incredibly difficult. And make no mistake, those credibility deficits work a number of different ways, and you folks exploit them just the same way. You folks exploit them against people on this side of the chamber whenever you need to make a political point. And it is every bit as unfair going either way. And I think of one instance in particular when the member for Olds Didsbury Three Hills was elected as the interim leader of the United Conservative Party, and he received a great deal of ridicule and criticism because 10 years previously he had participated in a radio program that espoused some very controversial views. And he said very simply and plainly that in 10 years his views had changed, and that he has learned a lot and he's a different person today. And yet, that didn't get him any credit at all. None. Not a bit. Because it was more convenient for you folks, and it was easier for your narrative to continue to brand him in a way that you felt was politically beneficial. And that's part of what is blocking good political dialogue in this province, Mr. Speaker, is that we are not acknowledging that people can and do change. We're not acknowledging that people can see a better way. You know, for example, the NDP, I have no doubt that this government today is trying to support the oil and gas industry, but if they weren't in government, if they were over here, as they were a little over 3 years ago, I suspect they would be every bit as hard on the oil and gas industry as they always have been. But they finally acknowledged that sitting over there in government, they don't have that luxury, that they must govern on behalf of all Albertans, and that includes our main economic driver. And so, Mr. Speaker, I will vote in favor of Bill 12. I think it is important that the government has this tool, but I think it's extremely important that this tool is used very judiciously. You know, the government House Leader talked about a hammer. Well, this is a power nailer, this bill. And the only thing we've done to reduce the potential use of it is put a time limit on it, and I think that's a very important improvement. But I am certainly concerned about this government using this bill. If I was an oil and gas investor, I would also be very concerned and hoping that at some point this bill could potentially be repealed if the conditions change. But in the meantime, I say to the government that the oil and gas industry is the frog and the scorpion from my fable. It's the frog. And the oil and gas industry is ever watchful for the scorpion and ever wary of its sting. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, are there any other questions under 29(2)A to the member from